Is it SIBO or are you dealing with SIFO? Well, are you even familiar with what SIFO is? Well, many individuals have heard of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but now my question to you is, are you dealing with a bacteria or are you dealing with a fungus, which is what would lead us to small intestinal fungal overgrowth? So let's talk about that and let's take a look at why this might be why it might be necessary to differentiate between those two, as well as why you would potentially be dealing with SIFO as opposed to SIBO. So again, just to reiterate these names and acronyms, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, versus small intestinal fungal overgrowth, SIFO. Typically, when we're talking about these organisms, it's not that these organisms are not supposed to be found in the small intestine. It is normal to find these organisms that make up SIBO and SIFO in the small intestine. However, the problem is that they've started to accumulate above a given threshold of what is considered ideal. Now, this can very much take place for fungus just like it can for bacteria. And in the case of the fungus, the species that is typically most often associated with this is one that many individuals have heard of. It's Candida, and more directly, Candida albicans is the fungus species that we typically liken to small intestinal fungal overgrowth. I do think it's worth noting that when we have different patterns of overgrowth in our intestines, we can differentiate these between the large intestine, the small intestine. We can differentiate between bacteria and fungus, and there's four primary categories of overgrowth. There's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, large intestinal bacterial overgrowth, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, and here's the important one for this conversation. The fourth one is small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Now, why would it be necessary to differentiate this versus, say, SIBO, where we're dealing with a bacteria, compared to SIFO, where we're looking at a fungus? Well, one of the reasons you might want to differentiate this is when you start to look at interventions to reduce this overgrowth. If you're looking at a pharmaceutical intervention, the intervention for a bacterial overgrowth is not going to be ideal for a fungal overgrowth. And the opposite is also true. If you're identifying a fungal overgrowth and that's your intervention, that intervention is going to be unique to fungus, but it's not going to have a benefit to bacteria of any degree. Now, I say that because it's not uncommon that a fungal overgrowth and a bacterial overgrowth present together. And this is where we likely want to begin to have some different thoughts on how do we approach dealing with these overgrowths. And one of the ways that we can do this is with botanicals, with herbals, as some people would typically call these. I prefer to call these botanicals. I think it's a more accurate naming. But regardless, botanicals have multiple mechanisms of action. And generally, the formulations that I'm using when I'm using a botanical approach on this are going to be multiple ingredient formulations. So not only are there multiple ingredients that each have a single mechanism of action of how to deal with these overgrowths of either bacteria or fungus, but they also, each ingredient typically has more than one mechanism of action. And that's in contrast many times to how pharmaceuticals are going to approach this, where it's a very specific mechanism of action. So when you look at those botanicals, in that common scenario where a bacterial overgrowth and a fungal overgrowth present together, those botanicals are going to be able to target both of those without the necessity to have to intervene with one that is unique to bacteria and one that is unique to fungus. So that is a more simplistic approach for you, and it's going to yield results against both of those organisms. And again, remember, the key here is that when you're looking at these overgrowths, this is not the idea with this and the effort is not towards eradication, because these are organisms that are inherently found in the body. They're inherently found in the gastrointestinal tract, in the small intestine. So let me be more specific. But they just shouldn't be above a given threshold. And so this is just an attempt to get them back under that threshold. Now, if you watch other videos on this topic where I talk about this, one of the things that you'll recall is, if you've looked at those, you'll see that a reduction in acid, a reduction in enzymes, a reduction in bile, those lack of motility, so slow motility of the bowels, those are going to be the things that are going to set up an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine. Fungus is no different. Those exact same factors are going to set up an overgrowth of fungus in the small intestine as well. The point of this is that as you go through that eradication, the efforts that you take when it comes to bacteria to prevent recurrence are just as important with a fungus. The long-term goal is, let's prevent the recurrence. Let's make sure that this doesn't relapse and occur again. And we need to do that with a fungus. And fungus are just as notorious for causing nutrient deficiencies. So we want to make sure that we at least give consideration to potentially what nutrient deficiencies have developed as well along the way. So, whether you're looking at, for example, some of the common things that are used for this, things like oil of oregano, berberine, there's numerous botanicals on this that we could point to. I'll do a whole video on different interventions in relation to SIBO, but all of those things are going to have benefits for both bacteria and for fungus. So think about, as you're looking at how you're going to deal with what you perceive as small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, at least ask the question, is this potentially also small intestinal fungal overgrowth? And one of the ways that in part you can answer that, if you're working with a skilled practitioner on this, is that if they're doing stool testing with you as part of the workup and assessment, then you can also get some idea based on what presents back on those stool tests as to whether or not there's an overgrowth of different fungal species, candida or other. So give it some consideration, just a different mindset in terms of maybe what's going on. Maybe it's not always a bacteria. Sometimes maybe it's a fungus. Other times maybe it's both. And so these strategies can help you deal with either or both, regardless of what the scenario looks like for you. So until next time, guys, I hope you find this information useful. I hope you can put it to use and begin to change how your gut is feeling and the symptoms that you're dealing with. And make sure you come back soon, and I'll continue to help educate you on this topic and give you solutions to ultimately prevent this from reoccurring again for you. Until next time, Dr. Arland Hill. Talk to you soon.